Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the talk. This paper is with my co-author, Oliver Holtemöller. He's also in the session, and probably he will be answering some of the hard questions. I'll take only the easy ones. We were working on another paper with Oliver at the time the corona crisis started. And we had the database and we were working on the same database. And when the crisis started, we thought like, oh God, there are these shutdowns, but what will be the impact on the corporate sector? The results that I will be presenting to you here are results for the United Kingdom and Germany only, but we have estimations for the largest economies, including France, Italy, Spain, and the results are very similar. So that's how we started with the closures. And when the closures happen, what will happen to the corporate sector? And I think this is an unprecedented crisis because the crisis is triggered by a virus and the policy reaction to the virus, which was shutting down most of the sectors in the economy. And the way that we approached it was to look at the risk of bankruptcy in the corporate sector and what happened to the risk of bankruptcy in the corporate sector. And we did not know anything at the time that we started about the nature of the virus, but probably this is neither the first nor the last in terms of different viruses that can have an impact on the economy. And in this particular case, social distancing was provided as the only remedy to ensure that the health system is not overwhelmed. And for us, it's basically, the slogan was protect the NHS. When we compare it to the previous crisis that we have extensively studied, the 2008 crisis, it was triggered by the financial sector. The 1929 Great Depression, again triggered by the financial sector. This one isn't. So it's a crisis that's triggered by the demand side of the economy. The Bank of England estimate at the time for the fall in output was 14%, and the last crisis with a similar fall in output was 3 centuries ago in 1709. And at that time, what happened, it's an agricultural economy, imagine. And at that time, what happened was the earth was iced, and therefore agricultural production had to stop. And there was no crop, and therefore the output had dropped considerably. In Germany, the decline was estimated to be more than 6%, and that's the largest decline for Germany since the Second World War. Now, we investigate Germany and United Kingdom, the two largest economies in Europe, and we estimate the risk of bankruptcy due to the shutdown measures. Financial distress has long-term consequences. Firms can be liquidated, but they can survive in various different firms. Some of them can continue to have negative earnings for quite long periods if they survive. And most of them will find it difficult to increase their investment expenditures and grow in the future. And a common feature for distressed firms is restructuring or living with very high leverage ratios for long. And usually the creditors lack information that is needed to make quick and correct liquidation decisions. So eventually, if the risk of bankruptcy in the corporate sector increases, that will put a burden on the banking system to deal with firms, a higher number of firms in financial distress. There is also a literature on zombie firms, mainly in Japan. So it's kind of like these are firms that are under distress for a length of time. They don't go bankrupt, but they just survive in the economy. Now, we thought that it's important at this stage, we don't have the end of year numbers at this stage, so it will be next March by the time we have the actual numbers. But we thought, at least at this stage, if we know the risk of bankruptcy and how widespread that risk is, it's important for designing long-term policies. So what we did is we looked at all firms, we looked at firms in shutdown industries, and we looked at firms in non-shutdown industries, but they will have residual impact on the non-shutdown industries as well. So the overall results were very high risk of bankruptcy. So about more than 90% of all firms, we see them as under risk of bankruptcy. And in non-shutdown sectors, we see about 60–70% of firms under risk of bankruptcy. So the database we have is quite comprehensive. It's the Amadeus Database. I mean, some of you might have used the database. The beauty of the database is we're not limited with listed firms, which usually happen to be the largest firms in the economy. We have micro firms, which have less than 10 workers, but they're quite small. We have small firms that have less than 50 workers, medium firms with less than 250 workers, and large firms with higher than 250 workers. So the listed firms in our sample were less than 1% of our sample. So that's why when we prepare the tables, you may not see the listed firms because they're a very small percentage of our sample. So overall, they represent between 30 to 60% in employment in these countries. And it's very representative of all industries and all size groups. So this is the univariate distributions of the variables that we're using. The main variable we use to measure the risk of distress, whether the firm is in distress or not, is the interest coverage ratio. So the practice is in the industry is if the firm has an interest coverage ratio of less than 1.5, then they're considered to be under distress, and it's very hard for them to find credit. We use a more conservative approach, and if the firm with its earnings cannot cover its interest, then we classify the firm as under distress. So that's a common measure of distress. We also use another two measures, and these two measures are important in the case of the Corona crisis, because the governments have furlough schemes, and they have also introduced schemes that the landlords cannot evict the tenants for extended periods if they didn't pay rent. And therefore, I mean, you would think that there are measures in place to prevent possible bankruptcies. But still, for example, Debenhams, a few weeks after the March shutdown was announced, applied for administration. A few weeks ago, Edinburgh Mill applied for administration despite these measures. And the main reason for these retailers to apply for administration is that, well, the government through the furlough schemes is paying a high portion of the salaries, and they're keeping the employees. They don't have to pay rent, they're protected. They don't have to leave their shop floors, but they have accounts payable. So they have to maintain the payments to their suppliers. So if they can't make their payments to their suppliers, then they apply to administration. So therefore, we look at the payables coverage ratio. So we look at how much earnings cover the payables. And we also look at how much the sales cover the payables. So these are the two additional measures that we're using. So in order to describe or measure the shutdown, we have data on a very detailed industry classification. We looked at that data, but more than that, we use a much more conservative measure of shutdown. So the measure we use is the year-on-year change in the monthly turnover by industry. So if the year-on-year change, say March 2020 to March 1919, if that change is above a 2 standard deviation distance, then we consider it to be an abnormal change and classify the industry as a shutdown industry. So that classification includes all sectors shut down by the government, and it's more conservative because we account for the actual extreme fall in turnover. And in certain industries, say in car manufacturing, air transport, the ratio we had was about 75%. In various industries, you can see here in this table that this ratio was somewhere between 75 to 65% in retail sale of any automotives, and manufacturing of motor vehicles minus 75%, etc. So I will report the findings first in terms of the financial indicators for the firms in shutdown industries. And when we look at the firms in shutdown industries, we observe that in general, these firms are more fragile. So in general, in these industries, the leverage rates are higher, retained earnings is lower, profitability rates are lower, interest expense scaled by profits is lower, and the ratio of payables to profitability is also lower. So in general, the shutdown sectors have more fragile structures than the non-shutdown sectors. Imagine that most of them are relate to retail trade, and that's kind of like expected for these sectors. I have more detailed numbers here on the slide. For example, the leverage is in the range of 60 to 70%. The working capital in wholesale and retail trade industries and administrative services, for example, the ratio of retained earnings to total assets is in the range of 20 to 30% in wholesale and retail, etc. So you can see that these ratios are much above the country averages in these sectors. The distress measure we use is the interest coverage ratio. And the practice I've mentioned is about 1.5 times the earnings. And below that, the risk for default is high. And our measure is much more conservative. So if the company cannot cover its interest payment, then we classify the company as in distress. In tranquil times, the percentage of firms under distress is in the range of 5 to 8%. And we have simulations for shutdowns for 1 month, 2 months, and 3 months. So we try to see what percentage of firms go under distress with shutdowns of 1 month, 2 months, and 3 months. So we estimate that if the shutdown is for 1 month, about 70 to 80% of firms fall into distress. If the shutdown is about 2 months, then we estimate about above 90% of all firms are under distress. And if the shutdown is for 3 months, then we estimate that about 98, 99% of these firms fall under risk of bankruptcy. These are very high numbers, and it indicates that there will be very severe economic and labor market consequences. We simulate assuming the furloughs. So these are the salary subsidies that the governments are given to prevent firms from going bankrupt or reducing employment and firing their employees. And when we assume the furloughs, that the firms do not have any payments, any salary payments, any payments to their employees, still the predicted risk of bankruptcy is very high, in the range of 95 to 97%. So that is when the government pays the labor bill entirely. We look at the non-shutdown industries as well, because there is a contagion of lower demand from the shutdown to the non-shutdown industries as well. So if there is a shutdown, for example, if you have a company that's car washing, for example, well, nobody is going out, nobody is going to work, so who's going to wash the cars? So we again have very conservative assumptions that in these industries, the loss in sales will be about 1/3 of the loss in sales in the shutdown industries. And still, we estimate more than 70% of firms to go under distress and carry a risk of bankruptcy. So under the furlough schemes, these estimates are still very high, in the range of 60%. And this is the non-shutdown industries. And again, the consequences for the rest of the rest of the economy are also major, and the consequences for employment will also be major in the non-shutdown industries. So now I will have a presentation of the different sizes of firms. So the micro firms are very small, less than 10 employees. And in these firms, a 1-month shutdown will put about more than 70% of firms under risk of bankruptcy, 2 months between 87 and 94% of firms, and 3 months will put about 93 to 97% of the firms under risk of bankruptcy. In non-shutdown industries, still very high rates, about 50%, about half the firms are under risk of bankruptcy. For small firms, so this is again very small firms, this is less than 50 workers, we show that a 1-month shutdown puts under risk of bankruptcy about 70 to 85% of firms, and 2 months is about 90% of firms, and 3 months puts about 98, 99% of small firms under risk of bankruptcy. In non-shutdown industries, these are about 60, 65% of all firms will be under risk of bankruptcy. Similarly, for medium firms, a 3-month shutdown puts about 98, 99% of firms under risk of bankruptcy, and about 70% of firms that are not in shutdown sectors under risk of bankruptcy. In terms of large firms, again, similarly, about 99% of large firms will be under risk of bankruptcy if the shutdown is for 3 months, and about 7 to 80% of non-shutdown industry firms are under risk of bankruptcy. So what we observe in this is that there are corporate consequences of the shutdowns during the corona crisis. And we measured the corporate consequences in terms of the distress, the risk of bankruptcy that the firms face. So we use a very strong database that includes all micro firms, small firms, medium firms, large firms. We're not limited by listed firms. And we show that the risk of bankruptcy is pervasive for all firms. That includes the very small firms, the micro firms, that includes the large firms, and it's across the different sizes. In terms of the industries, almost all firms in shutdown industries face a risk of bankruptcy. In terms of the non-shutdown industries, approximately 2/3 of firms face the risk of bankruptcy. And the furlough schemes, yes, they reduce the risk of bankruptcies, but not considerably. So, what we're saying is that the impact of the corona crisis is severe in job in the corporate sector, and therefore that should be part of the consideration when policies are designed. So the paper is in progress, and we're leaving the decisions to the prime ministers. But we want to point out that the corporate sector is facing a huge risk. So if you have any comments, any questions, they're all very welcome.
Thank you, Gulnur, for the presentation. I will enable Sushanta to ask his question.
Thank you, Alicia.
Sushanta, you may go.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you.
Hi, Sushanta.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. It's a very interesting way to participate in this webinar. So, I think the whole shutdown, I think why it's echoing. The voice is coming back to me. Should I switch off something? Right. So, to begin with, it's more of a supply shock, right? Because there is a disruption in supply chain, and therefore, there is going to be economic activity, and then subsequently it will translate into demand shock, right? People will be unemployed and so demand. So clearly, that companies, those who are unable to operate, they will experience significant decline in the earnings. Therefore, interest coverage ratio is going to decline, right?
Yeah.
Or they will be into financial stress and declared as bankrupt. Now, the ones who are likely to operate, I don't know why it's going. Is there a way to stop that?
Sorry, I think, your voice is cracking.
Yeah, I don't know why.
So you're talking about the supply chains. And you're talking about the decline in earnings.
Yeah.
I gathered that much, but I
No,
couldn't.
no, my point is, not, it is true, the industries which are shut down, clearly the firms in those industries will be in financial stress, right?
Yeah.
But there are industries which are able to operate. There are, maybe it depends on the technological intensity of a firm. I think you need to consider the degree of a technological intensity. Those firms will not be bankrupt. That's my point. So if you can get hold of that data, I think, many firms are now moving towards, they are moving into, becoming more technologically intensive. So I think you will have an interesting result if you can try to get some information on the extent of technological intensity.
Yeah, I think that's a very good idea. Thank you very much for pointing that out. I mean, most of the technologically intensive companies, say, including, we're talking about Amazon, Facebook, Netflix, etc., they are kind of like natural monopolies, and all of them are listed. So due to the nature of our sample, I mean, we can pull them and we can look at them separately. Due to the nature of our sample that we have small firms, the very small firms, micro firms, etc. So they constitute about less than 1% of the sample. So that's not reflected in the overall general results. But I think it's a very good idea. I think we can certainly do that. So we can, we can pull the listed firms separately and look at them separately, and we can pull the firms in high-tech industries that are making their operations mainly through the internet. And we've seen the price increases of those firms in the stock markets already. And they're pulling the stock market's returns already. I mean, we've seen extreme increases in internet traders since the beginning of the corona crisis. That's a very good idea. Thank you very much for that. Oliver, do you want to add something to it?
Hi, Sushanta. Thank you for the suggestion. I think what we can do is we can control for capital intensity.
Yes.
And
yes.
that would be a proxy. It's not exactly what you mentioned, but it would be close to that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
There's also another question in the chat, which I may answer concerning whether we have included banks in the sample. We did not. So there are a few sectors that we did exclude. Not only banks, but also insurance firms and public administration, defense, social security, and activities of households as employers. These all are excluded from our data set.
So you're answering the question about the banks.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so there seems to be another question. Elaborate more on the simulation process. Considering the likelihood of businesses to become insolvent, how the forecasting process is undertaken. Okay, it's a very simple simulation process. So we're calculating the possible, we're manipulating the sales for the main estimations. We're manipulating the sales, a reduction in sales, we're manipulating that. And we're estimating the number of firms that fall below the distress threshold. So when sales drop by 7-8%, how many firms are not able to pay their interest with their earnings? If the sale falls 15-20%, how many of them cannot pay their interest with their earnings? I mean, I said, I don't know if that answers the question.
Maybe you can show again slide number 26, page number 26. There is a table,
okay,
which makes it more transparent what we did, I think.
Okay.
So there you can see the risk of bankruptcy measured by the interest rate coverage ratio, or the dummy variable that we defined. And you can see there is this column with shutdown duration of 0 months. In that case, if there's no shutdown, you have just the unconditional probability of a firm going bankrupt, right? And this is, as Gulnur mentioned in the talk, 8% in Germany and about 6 or 5% in the UK. And then when we assume that these firms lose turnover for 1, 2, or 3 months, then we report this for the fraction of firms where the interest rate coverage ratio is below 1. And this is exactly here what you can see in the table. And of course, the more turnover is lost, the longer the shutdown duration, the more firms are under stress. Is it clear now?
There is a question on the Q&A.
We also have Nee and Andrew who'd like to raise their hands. So what I'll do, I'll permit them to talk. So you won't see them, but you'll hear them, because there's a bit of delay when we make people a presenter and then we change them back to an attendee. So Nee, I'll permit you to talk now. If you could unmute your mic, Nee.
Okay, thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Gulnur, for the presentation. My quick question is relating to the contagion effect of loss of sales. When you examine the contagion effect of loss of sales from these shutdown industries, are you identify the real customer, corporate customers of these shutdown industry firms?
No. I mean, we don't have enough data to do that, Nee. So maybe, we will have the actual sales loss when the statements are announced for this year as of March next year. So we don't have the actual data. So we assume that it's about 1/3. And that's kind of like more or less compatible with the actual situation. But there is no way that we can actually measure that.
Okay, so the contagion effect is based on the assumption of 1/3.
That's right. That's
okay,
right.
so it's not based on the industry relationships.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. It's not an unrealistic assumption, but it's basically based on the assumption, because there is no way that we can measure the actual loss in sales.
Okay, that's
not yet. Yeah, I mean, I'll make a note of it, that because we're planning to continue when the statements are announced next year. So then we will be able to measure the actual loss in sales in the not shut down sectors.
Yeah, I think it would be important to make it clear and when mentioning contagion effect. The other comments relating to if we're supposed to understand the overall effect of this corona crisis when it comes to the shutdown industry. I think this relates to the center point. My understanding is there are some industries has huge negative impact from the coronavirus. At the same time, there are other sectors in the economy, and which have stronger networks. So it relates to transfer spillover effect. So there are some other industries that get huge benefits. Some of them may be represented by the monopolists, such as the Zoom, the Microsoft Teams, this kind of industries. This is the more concentrated industry. Other type of industries may more suits in a more flexible, that requires a flexible environment when people work from home and have flexible time to control. So those industries may have greater earning impact, and then according to this transfer or spillover effect, they will further affect the downstream or upstream firms. So if to some point, I think people will ask the net effect. So this is probably something you can consider by further controlling or zoom in to this identify particular types of industries that benefits from the coronavirus, then comes out with a net effect.
I think that's a very good idea. I mean, we didn't do that. Well, we didn't do that. for two reasons. One of it is we can still pull all listed firms. So most of these firms that are kind of like natural monopolies in the new internet era are listed firms. So none of them are micro, small, medium, etc. We can definitely pull them and we can have a look at them separately. So we didn't use any weighting scheme either. So in terms of sales, if we use the weighting scheme, when you're talking about the net effect, well, the net effect may not be, so if we were scaling the firms in terms of their assets or in terms of their sales, then these firms have huge sales and they could be the size of a number of micro firms, etc. So the net effect, if scaled by sales, if scaled by assets, could be much lower than the effect we're reporting here. But that would be in favor of the largest firms in the economy. So, I mean, we could definitely, I think it's a good idea that we can identify the winners of the crisis. So who benefited from the crisis, and they increased sales, they increased, and because most of these firms have high entry costs because they operate as monopolies, but the variable costs are very low. So therefore, the profits should be increasing at a much faster rate. Thank you for the comment. I really appreciate that. Oliver, do you want to add to it?
No, not to that question.
Okay.
There are some other questions.
Okay.
Also.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nee.
Thank you.
Thank you. So Andrew has a question.
Yes, and I'll unmute him shortly. Andrew, I'm allowing you to talk now.
Okay.
Hello, good afternoon.
Hello, Andrew.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much. Also, thank you for a very interesting and a wonderful study.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We actually need studies like this, especially because of this, the effect of COVID-19. I learned so much from your study. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Although I missed the early part of your presentation, maybe that is why my question might actually be answered in the early part of your presentation. So I want to ask about, did your study consider the role of government interventions, okay, to companies, business owners? We could see, for instance, in the case of KLM, for instance, KLM airline, government of Netherlands actually intervened, not only for KLM, there are other businesses also. I'm here in Turkey. Turkish airline, for instance, I guess got intervention from the Turkish government. And also the same situation applies to some of these big companies. So did you consider this form of interventions by the governments of various nations, and how do you factor that in your study?
Thank you very much for the question. I think that's a very good question. The answer basically is no, we didn't. I mean, at the beginning when we started this, the one thing that we talked with Oliver, I remember, as we said, well, all airlines will be state-owned. So, I mean, they can't stand this shutdown. They will all be state-owned. But we didn't look at the airline industry particularly, and we didn't look at the cash injections into the airline industry particularly. So the two policy measures that we've included into the analysis, one is the shutdown decision itself, the sectors that are shut down, and we have a much more conservative measure. The second one is the furlough schemes. So we considered the furlough schemes, and the firm does not have to pay any salary, so there's no labor cost. So, I mean, how much does it reduce the risk of bankruptcy? I think your example is very good, especially in terms of the airlines. I mean, some airlines, like British Airlines, for example,
Yes.
had to lay out personnel.
Mm.
Others didn't because the governments injected cash.
Cash, yes.
Yes, there were cash injections, and that's how they kept the airline afloat.
Yes.
We didn't look into that. I mean, I'm suspecting that there will be a huge literature about the new state ownership schemes in response to the corona crisis. I mean, most national airlines probably will receive some sort of cash injection. I don't know, but we didn't look at that. But that's a very good point. Thank you.
Okay.
Oliver, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, you can think of this as follows. If there is a subsidy to the firm that replaces or compensates the firm for the loss in turnover, then this, of course, will reduce the risk of bankruptcy, right? So it's a thought experiment that we do. How much of the loss in turnover can actually be, covered by the firms without going bankrupt? And if the loss in turnover is too large, then there are more possibilities. One is bankruptcy, but possibility two is help from the state, and this is more a kind of a policy answer, and we don't know that yet. So we have to wait and see.
And maybe there is a possibility three. So the winners of the crisis, say Amazon, etc., they're going to have investments in these sectors that either become zombies or become under distress. So there will be restructuring of various different sorts.
Right.
Okay. So do we have any other comments or questions?
I believe there is one, Gulnur, in the chat from
See if we
Raven.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. So,
no, there's one other question on the criteria for government subsidies. And first, I can confirm that we have the same situation in Germany, right? I also think that the most support goes to the loudest shouters on the market. That's exactly the same here. And of course, that's not the best criterion. I fully agree. But this question goes beyond the scope of our study. So we have not compared various policy measures to each other. We are one step before that. We just want to understand what's actually going on. And this is a necessary work that we have to do first before we can assess various policy measures and compare them to each other.
Is this in response to Praveen's question?
Right, yeah.
Okay, so let me read it out so that everyone knows what the question is. The current process of providing discretionary government help to a particular industry sector seems very random, no clear objective criteria published. It appears that those who cry loudest seem to get maximum help. What do you think should be the objective criteria for the government to provide COVID relief, and whether you intend to propose objective and criteria-based relief package in your research? Yeah, I agree with Oliver, we're not there yet. Yeah, we certainly are not there yet. And I don't think that, I don't think that, there could be an objective way in those sort of decisions. So it depends from which angle you're looking at. I mean, if you're looking into employment impact and if you're trying to protect the employment, well, obviously, the cash injections should be made to the very small firms and they should be under protection. And if you're, well, in certain cases, you have to deal with labor unions. You might prioritize that. Well, we really don't know, and we didn't look into that.
An additional remark is maybe that we also need more interdisciplinary work on that. It's not only economic criteria that are important here. If you think of schools, for example, or other, if people isolate themselves and stay in their apartments for a long time, this has also social consequences, and it's very important to have more interdisciplinary work on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. In terms of, in terms of labor market consequences, I'm expecting that there will be papers coming out. Maybe not, there isn't much currently. People are mainly investigating the impact on the working population, how life has become more difficult, but maybe there will be studies on the job losses as well. Okay, any further questions or comments? Asad?
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for your presentation. That was really informative and great. I just wanted to add something about these government subsidies that I think Andrew mentioned earlier. There are several theories on this. One of them is moral hazard theory. We have seen the same thing in earlier crisis as well, for instance, in 2008 and 2009 financial crisis. The fact that governments do lend some help to, especially to travel agencies and air industry, is that those companies are too big to fail, and governments just do not dare to somehow let them to go insolvent and distressed. And the other is the moral hazard, especially those big companies and big organizations do have very key relationships to the governments. So they are more likely to receive some help from governments in terms of financial support, or even some, let's say, softenings of the regulations, shutdown regulations. So I just wanted to add this because it was somehow related to the research area that I'm dealing with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Asad. I think these are very good points. We didn't look particularly into any one of those, but I think these are really very important points, because once a government decides to make a subsidy, so whichever sector they choose, it creates precedents for the future, and we've seen it with financial crisis. So the firms don't have a reason to keep their financial ratios high. But if it's under government orders that you're not operating, well, what can the company do anyway, isn't it? So I think, some of them will be very new issues, including the moral hazard question. I'm not really sure where the moral hazard lies, because it could be like the policy itself, shutting down the industry, doesn't enable the firm to make sales. So if it's a decision which is beyond the firm, then that needs to be compensated. But at the same time, who is going to compensate for that? Not the users of the service of this firm, but the taxpayer in general, either in terms of inflation or in terms of higher taxes. And it opens a lot of questions on the moral hazard aspect. Is this something that is subsidized by the taxpayer money? That will be probably a long discussion. The too big to fail, again, we'll see it's a matter of choice. So about where the cash injections will be made, then, if the cash injections are made into sectors or firms that are too big to fail, well, that will be another discussion topic. Thank you. Thank you for that. Oliver, do you want to add to it?
No.
Okay, so do we have any more questions? Sushanta sends us a paper about the role of innovation intensity during bad times. So thank you very much, Sushanta. We'll have a look at the paper. I'm opening it now so that we don't lose the link. yeah, probably there will be survivors, and as Neem mentions, there will be firms that benefit from the crisis as well. And it will be another case of the survival of the fittest, and we'll see who were the fittest. Okay, I think time is up. Alicia, if there isn't any other question.
I don't believe that there are any more questions. I know that in the chat, Saad asked, did you include banks in your sample? Banks should be affected due to delaying repayment of loans and interest payments. But I'm not sure if that's been answered already.
Which one is it?
So this was in the chat. So this was asked a bit earlier. So Saad Aftab asked, did you include banks in your sample? Banks should be affected due to delay in repayment of loans and interest payments.
Yeah, I think Oliver answered that question.
Yeah, I've answered that question already.
Yeah.
So
Lovely.
banks are not included.
Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you for the clarification.
Okay. I think we enjoyed it a lot, didn't we, Oliver? We had very good comments, and we have a lot.
Right. Thank you.
It certainly will be a better one. Yeah, we appreciate all the questions, and we appreciate all the comments. And thank you very much. And feel free to contact us separately if you have, if you want to discuss anything about the papers. Thank you for coming.